thanks so much to the organizers for having us, and we're super excited to discuss for the next 15 minutes a little bit on clinical trials. So perhaps we'll start with some introductions. So I'm going to ask Danielle maybe to introduce herself, and beyond her affiliation, Danielle will tell us a little bit about what she does on a day-to-day basis and how it intersects with today's topic, which is clinical trials.
Sure. Oh, is this on? Yeah. Oh, can you hear me? No.
There you go.
Oh, this one?
There you go.
Okay. Hi, I'm Danielle Hartig, and I'm with UCB Pharmaceuticals, and I am a patient engagement and advocacy lead. So I have the distinct pleasure of working within the patient community and for MOGAD and working with different organizations such as Sumaira Foundation and others. And I love it because I get to talk to patients, I get to understand more about your journey and what you live with, and then hopefully bring those insights into UCB. And our goal is to not only develop or do things for patients, but with patients. So that means bringing you into the development process and learning really about the unmet needs and how we can best serve you. And then I also work with different teams at UCB to help bring the patient voice to them.
All right, so thanks so much, Danielle. I'm super excited to talk to you and for you to share kind of your perspectives on clinical trials. So my name is Daniel Ontaneda. I'm a neurologist, also a neuroimmunologist. So some of my absolutely favorite patients are here today. So hello, there we go. Thank you guys for coming. And I, of course, see multiple sclerosis patients, but also MOGAD and NMOSD patients. And one of my roles at the Cleveland Clinic is the director of research. So we kind of intersect on exactly what clinical trials are and kind of the management of clinical trials. And that's what we're going to be talking to you guys about today. So we're going to divide the session up into kind of two sections, if you will. The first section will be kind of a broad discussion of what clinical trials are, kind of to just clarify some definitions. What are the different phases of clinical trials? And also kind of what are the common challenges or barriers that we have in clinical trials. And of course, Danielle, who's intimately involved with conduct of clinical trials, will be able to give you her perspectives on that. And then I think in the second part, we'll probably save about 7 or 8 minutes for that. Danielle wants to talk to you about specifically about a trial that UCB is conducting, and she's basically in charge of. So that will be fantastic.
I wish, not in charge of.
All right. I hear she's really important. So. But let's start with a little bit of definitions. I think clinical trials are specifically studies that are designed to test medications, therapeutics that actually can get from the discovery phase when we test them initially in the laboratory in animal models. Then we take them into humans first, and then we take them into individuals who actually have the condition that we're interested in treating. And the ultimate goal of all these studies is to present that data to the regulatory agencies, such as the Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency are probably the two largest ones. And based on the results of those trials, those agencies actually approve medications. And once the medications are approved, that's when we as providers, as clinicians, can actually start prescribing the medications, and of course, patients can start taking them. So clinical trials actually have to follow a very specific pathway in order to get approved. It starts with what we call our pre-human studies, and so these are studies that typically are in the lab. Many times they involve animal models of the disease, and many times they fail. The reality is that there's a lot of compounds that get tested in the lab that actually don't go anywhere. They're too toxic sometimes, and we identify them in the lab, or they don't work well enough in the lab. But once you've identified a compound or a medication that you think works in an animal model or perhaps in a test tube environment, then you take it into a phase 1 study. And phase 1 studies are studies that are determining the safety of a medication. They're typically done in healthy individuals. And typically these are people who sign up for the studies. They basically say, I want to participate in research, and they come into them. Or they sometimes can actually be in, for example, multiple sclerosis, MOGAD, or NMO patients. Once those studies are done, it's determined, and these are typically small studies. We're talking somewhere between 10 and 30 patients at a time. Then we take them into phase 2 clinical trials. And phase 2 clinical trials are a little bit larger. Typically, the number varies depending on the condition, but can go anywhere from about 50 patients to about 200 or 300 patients. And typically, they're described as what we call a dose-finding study. So in that, we're, one, trying to determine, once again, that it's safer in the population where it's intended to be used. So typically, it will be in MOGAD or NMO patients. And two, what we're trying to do is we're trying to test different dosages of the medication that we want to develop. Those trials actually also serve the pharmaceutical companies to determine if the medication is likely to be successful long term. So they might do a phase 2 study and they say, well, we're going to look at the dose, we're also looking at safety, but it's kind of a gateway. And you say, well, based on the results of a phase 2 study, I'm going to decide if I take the final step, which is a phase 3 clinical trial. And phase 3 clinical trials, the outcomes are always going to be something that's clinically meaningful to people who have the condition, and will typically be a little bit larger. Typically in autoimmune diseases, they're in the orders of 300, 400, up to 2,000 patients at a time. They're typically multi-center, they're typically international. Specifically in diseases like NMO and MOGAD, where we consider these disease rare diseases, we have to do them across the whole world in order to recruit patients efficiently into them. And then once you have your result of a phase 3 study, which is typically a slightly longer study, typically lasts about, typically is somewhere between 2 and 3 years. Based on those results, the industry partner actually puts together an application that goes to the Food and Drug Administration for approval of the medication. And you would say, well, the medication's approved, that's where things end, but actually that's not where things end. Because then we take it one step further. Once the medication is approved and once individuals with the condition are using the medication, then we do something called phase 4 studies. And phase 4 studies are studies that are designed to look at both the safety and kind of efficacy more in the real world outside of a clinical trial population. And that would be like using a medication when your physician or your provider prescribes one. So I've kind of described the overall kind of basis of kind of what clinical trial work is. I think it's really important to know this. I think it's really important for people to participate in trials. If you don't participate in trials, really, we can't get medications approved. And, I always ask my patients always ask me, why should I participate in a trial? And the number one answer, we studied this actually in focus groups, the number one answer of why people participate in trials is because 5 or 10 years down the road, when there's somebody who's in your same shoes, who's facing a new diagnosis, they want to be in a better position than you were in terms of the number of medications, what we know about the medications, and also how to pick those medications most efficiently. So that's my overview of clinical trials. I'll hand it over to Danielle and see if, before she goes into her study specifically, if she could give us some comments on, specifically in the NMO and MOGAD sphere, what's special about clinical trials and what are the specific challenges you might run into?
So very, very good question. And it's funny that you said what you just said, because I always think of when a patient is sitting in front of a doctor and they're asking their doctor, how would this treatment specifically work for me? And we couldn't possibly know unless we studied it in people like you. And so it's so important to have a very diverse group of patients to understand how it's going to behave, so to speak, or work in different groups of patients. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges we face right now. And I sit on a panel with advocacy and engagement leads from other pharmaceutical companies, and we share ideas and we talk about how to reach patients to make them aware of clinical trials and the importance of participation. And really the biggest hurdle we have is getting diversity in clinical trials. And I think it stems from a couple different things. There's maybe a historical stigma about participating in clinical trials or being viewed as a guinea pig. And I think there's a lot of patients, I still get questions of, the pharmaceutical company's role and can they change data? And there's, this very well, studies are very strict and they're very rigorous. And a lot of that is intended to reduce any bias so that the doctor, the nurses, the staff, the clinical trial staff team, you, the patient, your caregiver, nobody knows if you're on a study drug or a placebo. Nobody knows, everyone is randomized. That's why they call them blinded or double-blinded studies, to reduce bias. We don't get to choose who gets what. It's completely random, and it's really designed to reduce bias all the way through. And there's a lot of third-party regulatory agencies. I think you mentioned the FDA, but there's also IRB boards that review all clinical trials to make sure that they're ethical, that they're rigorous, and that they're done to all ethical standards. There's ethics committees that review them. So there's a lot of folks beyond the pharmaceutical company that are very involved. And one of the trends that I love to see right now is involving patients from the very start. So, you know, in the olden days, they would design a clinical trial without patient involvement. And so they're working within the physician community and the physicians who treat the specific condition and the patients to understand what is important to them, what's realistic. You don't want to design a trial that nobody's going to participate in. So really getting patients to participate in the development of a trial from the very start, and that's a trend that I love seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you highlighted several points that are super important. One, diversity. Two, there's a history of, you know, medical research perhaps not being the most fair if you go back in history. And so there's naturally going to be some, you know, mistrust in kind of how we conduct research. But I think the points you make are good. That is, research now has kind of evolved substantially. It's governed by IRB boards. And I think the main thing is that research is completely voluntary. So I always tell people, participate in this trial. If at any moment you want to pull out, you can pull out. So it's a fully autonomous decision. And, you know, there's plenty of research that's done by industry or pharmaceutical companies, but there's a lot of trials and research that we do ourselves as clinicians. And, you know, many times we do those in very close contact with people with the condition. That is, they advise, they decide what the good outcomes are to look at. So I think these kind of all tail in together. So, you know, hopefully this was helpful. One, to understand kind of what clinical trials are like, and two, to kind of motivate you to think about trials, ask your doctor about trials that you could participate in, be aware of trials that are being done, and there's, you know, a lot of information available online on those, of course, specifically the government. So the FDA has information on ongoing trials in specific conditions, and they're quite easy to find. And now maybe let's learn about your study, which I am super interested in.
Definitely. So it's amazing to think back over the last 5+ years, the inroads that we've made in NMOSD. And as you all know, there are no approved, FDA-approved treatments for MOGAD. So in order to get to a place where we have a specific treatment just for MOGAD patients, we need to go through the clinical trial process. And there is a clinical trial that we'll learn about. Let's see, we go. It's called the COSMOG trial, and it's an investigational study, and it's looking at rosanoliximab. I know that's a mouthful. We just call it Rosie to make it easy on you. But it was recently approved by the FDA for generalized myasthenia gravis, or MG, in adults with that condition. And so it was proven to be safe and effective in another autoimmune disease, so that gives us some safety and security that you're not the first to try it. You're not the first in phase 3. It works differently than other drugs currently used for MOGAD in the respect that it's thought to target IgG, which is an antibody that attacks the MOG protein. So it's thought to reduce IgG levels. So thought to be a little bit more targeted, but, you know, like many medications, we don't completely understand the exact mechanism, so that's the point of why we're studying it. It's administered weekly as a subcutaneous under the skin, and I know some of you are probably immediately, alarm bells are ringing, thinking it's a weekly study. And for most patients and most sites, there is at-home nursing available. So after your 5th visit, because there are some early visits where there's a couple weeks of screening, and then you go into the next phase. So the first 5 weeks need to be at the center, and then you could, if your center has at-home nursing, you could have a nurse come to your home at your schedule, your convenience, and do the administration in your home, which only takes 10 minutes. It's very quick. as we talked about, studies are completely voluntary. This study has 3 phases: the screening phase, which is 2 visits, to really understand if it's a fit for you and your lifestyle, and if you meet some of the inclusion criteria. The second phase is the double-blind treatment period, which we talked about, double-blind, and this is where you're randomized into one of 2 groups, the placebo group and the clinical trial, those that are getting Rosie. And I know it's a little bit daunting and a little bit scary, and this is one of the barriers of why patients do not participate in clinical trials, because they think, I don't want to be the person who gets the placebo. And this is one of the benefits, I think, of participating in a clinical trial, is that you're at centers of excellence like Cleveland Clinic or University Hospital. You have a team that is constantly monitoring you. They have a plan in place. If there's anything, if you're on a placebo, which we don't know, nobody knows, but if you have a relapse, they're immediately understanding that, adjudicating, make sure it is a relapse, treating it, and then you have the option to go into an open label phase where everybody gets the drug. And the placebo phase is the third phase, and it was designed specifically so everyone has an opportunity to take the drug. And you know, a clinical trial can be long, and that's why it's voluntary and you have the opportunity to drop out. So you may be asking, who's eligible for this trial? It's anyone that's been diagnosed with MOG and has had a positive MOG test in the last 6 months, plus anyone between the ages of 18 and 89 who has had optical neuritis, transverse myelitis, ADEM, or MOGAD encephalitis. So these are some of the people who would qualify, and then they take those 2 weeks to do some tests and go through all of these, and there's some additional inclusion and exclusion criteria that they review over those 2 weeks. And then if you pass that phase and it's right for you, you would go into the treatment phase. One thing I will say is there are several treatment centers. There's 13 in the US, and there's one right here in Cleveland, Dr. Aboud, and I think the team is right over here. And his entire team is here, Davina and Ashley and Eileen. And then from UCB, Darlene is also here with us. So if you have any questions, we have brochures at the table. Oops, sorry. We have brochures at the table and a QR code that can take you through, and I'll show you the QR code. I didn't use the slides, sorry, because it's probably, but those are all the sites, and if you want to learn more, you can utilize the QR code, or you can reach out to Dr. Aboud and his staff who are here to answer any questions. One of the biggest barriers, I think, also for clinical trials is thinking, number one, there aren't clinical trial sites in every single city in the US, so how do you get to them? And the teams have thought about this to make sure that there's support, whether it's travel. We actually have a patient in our clinical trial who initially, he's from California. Before that site opened, he traveled to Dr. Levy's site in Boston every week. Well, for the first few months, and then he did at home. But so we pay for, and any pharmaceutical company, they pay for travel, food, whatever it is. If there's babysitting services, train, whatever it is, they'll pay to help you and support you to get to a clinical trial site. Because we know it's a burden, and you're taking time out of your lives and your schedule to participate. And it's so meaningful to the community. It's meaningful to other patients, especially those who will come after you. And the road to get to a approved medication for MOGAD patients. So if there's any questions, please seek out the team. They're here to answer any questions you may have. And hopefully you'll think about participating in a clinical trial. And there's so many things now to make it easy on you that hopefully it's something that could fit in your life.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Danielle. Great insight. This seems like an amazing opportunity for a lot of patients. And the NMO MOGAD world has now been, a place where there is a lot of trials and there's a lot of opportunities. So we probably should close just reminding everybody that, trials, participation in trials, that is participating in a randomized clinical trial, is super important, but is one of the multiple ways you can be involved in research. And, I think that we all kind of have somewhat of a role to play in this. And I think people with the condition MOGAD and NMOSD are probably the ones that should be the most involved and the ones that are pushing their clinicians, pushing their communities to participate in research, be part of research. You know, the Samira Foundation itself has always been a huge supporter of research. So any way you can to build community, think about research, participate in research in any way you can, I think is important. And really what this ends up is with, you know, a better quality of life down the road for people who have MOGAD and NMOSD. So I think with that, we will close. I know we're a little bit over time, but I think it was time well used. I want to thank Danielle for her participation, and thank you guys all for your attention.
Thank you so much.